This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Welcome to Turkey Trends, part of Ahval podcast series. I am Nervana Mahmoud. First, they invent a story. Then they spread it as if it is unquestioned fact. Then they use it against their opponents. That's how conspiracies are manufactured. And if you are from the Middle East like me, you will be aware of many conspiracies ingrained in psyche of entire societies. Unfortunately, conspiracies have victims, and one of them is my guest today, Professor Henri Barkey, Professor of International Relations in Lehigh University, and adjunct senior fellow in the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Barkey, it's a pleasure to have you today in this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Nervana.
Right. You wrote a very moving article about your ordeal because 5 years ago, you was falsely accused by the Erdogan government in Turkey of plotting the 2016 coup. Briefly refresh the mind of my audience about what happened. Unfortunately, you was in the wrong place in the wrong time, if I may say.
Well, at the time, I was the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is a think tank in downtown Washington. And we had a grant at the Wilson Center that my predecessor had gotten, which was to look at Middle East reactions to then President Barack Obama's Iran deal, the JCPOA. And since it was Middle East reactions, including Turkey, I decided to hold the workshop, I should say, with a Turkish think tank in Istanbul, because it was easier to bring people to Istanbul from the Middle East and bring them all the way to Washington. And so that's how we decided to do it with this other think tank. And we did it on an island near Istanbul, which is about an hour by ferry. And we convened on the 15th of July, and the coup happened that night. And our meetings were on Saturday and Sunday, the 16th and the 17th. When it became apparent at 2 or 4 o'clock in the morning that the coup had failed, we decided, my colleague from the Turkish think tank and myself, we decided that we would go ahead with the workshop the next day as planned. I mean, we had brought all these people to Istanbul, and that's what we did. And then it ended on Sunday afternoon. Everybody dispersed. I went to Istanbul, and a few days later, I came back to Washington, and then articles started to appear in the Turkish press, which were very bizarre because not only were they accusing me of being part of the coup, but these papers, and you have to understand, most Turkish journalists are not really hardworking investigative journalists, had details like exactly at what time I crossed Turkish customs, what time I entered, what time I left. This is details that only a government would have. So the government clearly was inciting the press to write these things. And it started, that's when it started. And then it became very, very, very big. And it served different purposes with time.
Yes. So I was going into that. First, I mean, it's interesting how they've been clearly following you. And immediately, after a few days, they immediately spread the accusation. It took them no time to do that, which question their motive. So what are their motive from your perspective?
So, I mean, look, you raise an interesting question, which is, let me give you, I came to Istanbul Sunday night. Monday night, I had dinner with somebody who we'll talk about later, Osman Kavala. Sorry, I did not have dinner with him. I was having dinner with a friend of mine, and I bumped into Osman Kavala in the restaurant. That was Monday night. Tuesday, I left Turkey to come back to Washington. On Thursday, the first article appeared, right? So your point is a very important one in the sense, for that, I don't have an answer. How come they managed to start this process so quickly? right? The press did not know I was there. I mean, this was not a public event. So only the government knew.
Right.
Right.
Which bring me to, you know, as I mentioned in my introduction, if you're familiar with conspiracy, they usually look initially for conspiracy material. And Henri Barkey, someone who served in the State Department, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yes.
you co-authored a book with an ex-CIA. You're obviously Jewish. Your wife have worked in something relate council intelligence.
The National Intelligence Council, which is the think tank of the intelligence community in the United States.
From Middle Eastern perspective, you are spot on, perfect material, like for a conspiracy to add. Clearly, they followed you in Istanbul, and once the 2016 coup happened, it triggered all the desire to look for someone to blame, I suppose. But why you think, is it the American link, or just because unfortunately you bumped into Osman Kavala, who is a guy absolutely hated by Erdogan?
No, Osman Kavala comes into the picture later, almost maybe a year and a half later.
Right.
So let me just say one thing. The Turkish government knew I was coming to do this workshop because I had talked to the number 2 at the Turkish embassy a few days before I left and told him, look, I'm coming in to do this workshop, and I'm going to do it in this wonderful island. And he kind of was jealous. I mean, we joked about it. And so I had told the Turkish government that I was coming. So it was not a secret to them that I was coming. I think they decided to use me for the reasons you mentioned, as a link to the United States, because they wanted to blame the US government for the coup, right? So how to do it? They were also angry at the US government because the US government took its time to kind of condemn the coup. It didn't do it automatically. I mean, that's what the Turks keep saying, that they were very upset at that. But it is always convenient in Turkey to blame the United States for just about everything. I mean, if the weather is bad, it's the United States' fault, right? If there are the fires in southwestern Turkey, it's the United States' fault. And so how do you blame the United States? So I was a perfect tool. I have to say, it was quite imaginative of them to kind of so quickly put it together, right? Mm-hmm. That, you know, the decision to blame me and us blame the United States 4 days or 3 days after, or I should say 4 days after the events, is actually quite fast for a government. I mean, it's quite impressive.
Right. How the Osman Kavala came in the equation? You said a year or 2 years after?
Yes. What happened was Osman Kavala, my connection to Osman Kavala, let me say. So I told you, I said, on the Monday night, I went to my favorite restaurant in Istanbul, was having dinner with a Turkish journalist. And as I walked in, Osman was there having dinner with 2 Europeans. He saw me, he got up, you know, we know each other a little bit. I actually don't know him very well. He's a very good friend of my sister's. He also, in many interviews, he actually said that. He said, I don't know Henri very well, but I know his sister very well. And so we chatted, you know, politely for a few minutes about what I was doing, what he was doing, etc. And then I went and had dinner with my friend. So, but that piece of information did not appear until much, much later. And the reason is that Osman was being tried. He was arrested a few months after that encounter for something else, and he was jailed. But he, for reasons that actually surprised me to this day, he was found not guilty by the court. Right. And Erdogan was furious at that. So as he was being released from prison, before he could leave prison, they came up with this bogus accusation that he participated with me in the coup. So the first reason why I was accused was to accuse the United States. But then I became useful to keep Osman in jail. Osman has been in jail now for 4 years, right? And most of the indictment now is about, actually the indictment is about really his participation in the coup. There is no, I mean, I have the indictment, I've read it many, many times, it's public, and there's English translations. I mean, nobody finds any evidence, but that encounter in that restaurant is what made them think that, or gave them the, shall we say, the excuse to blame him. But it is really to keep him in jail because he's now being accused of overthrowing the government, so they can keep him in jail indefinitely.
Right.
Although his lawyer says that it's only 2 years and he should be released by now, but we'll see.
Right. I guess people look from very low bar and they say, at least Osman Kavala in jail, but you are free.
Right.
And what I was stuck by in your latest article is how you describe the trauma of all this accusation and how it upended your life, it impacted your life in a very negative way. Kindly highlight that a little bit more.
Right. I mean, look, there's no question that I'm lucky in the sense that I'm here. I mean, you know, when it's just outside Washington, in my house, I'm fine, and Osman is in jail. They would have found probably another reason to keep Osman in jail because Erdogan really has, he really dislikes, hates Osman. But in my case, this tragedy for me was that this could have been prevented. When I saw all this happening, and I was at the Wilson Center, I had a meeting with the head of the Wilson Center, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, and 4 vice presidents. And I told them at the time, I said, look, this is going to get very big. This is going to be really, it's going to do a lot of damage to the Wilson Center, to me. We need to do something. And I had this plan for Jane Harman. She absolutely refused to do anything for me. Absolutely. I mean, it was really shocking, especially because the Wilson Center is known for standing up, especially in previous leadership, standing behind its people.
Right.
And she was more concerned about I having a meeting with Senator Dianne Feinstein to brief her about Turkey. And she told me that I could not meet Dianne Feinstein. I said, why? No, she wouldn't let me. And I said, no, I will go. And her office called Dianne Feinstein's office and canceled my meeting. I mean, at the time when I'm under attack, she undermined me. And, but so that's how it could have, as I said, it could have been mitigated. There was, I mean, I had some strategies. The upshot is because there's this constant barrage of attacks on me in the Turkish press, and because people in Turkey now get jailed for a tweet, let alone participating in a coup or knowing a coup maker, people are afraid. So I have lost contact with just about everybody in Turkey.
Right.
And friends don't call me. Friends, you know, I mentioned one friend who came to Washington and used her ex-husband's telephone to call me because she said, look, I'm sorry, I erased you from all my devices. This was a very close friend of mine and is a very close friend of mine. I'm not going to say was, but it's the same thing with whether it's news agencies or newspapers, including Western ones, to think tanks. People have cut me out, and, you know, fine. That's their choice there, because what happens is that the Turks, I mean, some Turks are afraid of being at a conference with me in the same room. I'll give you one example. I was invited by a British think tank to a meeting. I think it was in Italy. And then one day I got a call from a senior former US official, very senior, who's on the board of that foundation, and said, look, the foundation has invited you, accepted, but they're very worried that the Turks won't show up. They're putting pressure on the foundation to disinvite you. I said, look, I accepted the invitation. They have every right to rescind the invitation, but I'm not pulling out, and as a matter of principle. And this former official and another former official who also was on the board apparently told the foundation that if they disinvited me, they would resign from their board. So but the Turkish participation was weak, right? So as a result, now I see, I mean, I hear of meetings, etc., which, you know, I don't have to be invited to all meetings, but I mean, you would think that occasionally I would be invited to meetings, and I don't. But fine, what can I do? I mean, there's nothing. I mean,
you highlighted. Sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, I mean, I wrote this article also as a catharsis piece because this has been bothering me a lot. Now I'm done. I'm finished.
Well, I appreciate your courage to writing about all that and how it impacted you. You raised two important points. Number one, how conspiracy should have been confronted, and how, because of lack of confrontation, how it become a huge bubble that it's very difficult to contain. So do you feel if the American societies and within the circle of think tanks, politicians, they pay enough interest to countering conspiracies coming from countries, at least a country like Turkey, which is a NATO ally, or clearly from your case, the response is just to ignore and hope for the best?
Look, I mean, not that my case is necessarily analogous to what's happening in the United States, but we are seeing it now with what happened with the elections in the United States. I mean, people want to shut their eyes and hope that things will go away, or if they close their eyes, that somehow miraculously these conspiracies are going to go away. And the truth is, conspiracies do not go away because they tend to develop roots and feet, if you want. From my experience, what I can tell you is that when I look at the Turkish press, even sometimes people who are opposed to the Erdogan government have gotten used to refer to me as a CIA agent or a CIA advisor or something like that. The language, the conspiracy language eventually permeates everything. So then you become a tool, somebody wants to accuse somebody else or insult somebody else, they use me. I'll give you one example. One of the deputy chiefs of the Turkish parliament on the ruling AKP party, the other day attacked the main opposition leader, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu. And how did he attack him? And this became, went viral. He said, well, the night of the coup, there were two people drinking coffee. One was you, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, and the other was Osman Kavala's friend, Henri Barkey.
Wow.
Right? And the other thing you will see, occasionally there will be whole columns written on me by journalists who ascribe to me not just the coup, but the something called the Great Middle East Plan that apparently I concocted with my co-author. The book was on the Kurds, but Graham Fuller. But they make up things, but everybody now assume that this is correct, and you see it on Twitter. I mean, I get continuously attacks, and people say, how dare you say you were not the coup? We know that. I mean, give you one example. Everybody says that Osman Kavala and I talked for 93 and a half hours on the phone.
Wow.
Right? I mean, I joked at one point, I don't talk to my wife that long, but so how do they say that? In the indictment, the prosecutors admit that they have absolutely no proof of direct contact between Osman and me. They can't find it, right? But our phones were in the same vicinity in town of Istanbul, in the core of Istanbul, which may house 5 million people. But the cell towers picked up the fact that my phone was, let's say, location A, and 3 miles away, Osman's one was on this at the same time, right? So that's proof that we talked. But they say that they don't have a record of the conversation. But this 93 and a half hours is now taken as the absolute truth, right? And everybody says, you say you and Osman didn't talk, but you talked for 93 and a half hours, right? How can you dispute that? I mean, at this stage, you can't. So the point, that's why I say, and as you also mentioned, that when you have conspiracies, you absolutely have to confront them immediately. Otherwise, they become institutionalized.
Right. You not, you mentioned that a lot of think tanks and meetings you are not invited for, and
I'm surmising. I hear about them, and
exactly. But in this podcast, it will be a pleasure to hear your perspective about the current state of affairs between the United States and Turkey. A lot of people talk about the tendency to compartmentalize the relationship and put the difference on one side and the common ground on one side. But forgive me for seeing that I hardly see any common ground these days. How do you see things?
Well, the common ground is really an instrumentalist approach. I mean, let me put it this way. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey and the United States have had a very, very long relationship. And American politicians, American government leaders have always had this tendency of saying, look, Turkey is far too important for us to lose. So there's been a tendency of allowing the Turks to get away with a great deal. And let's face it, Turkey, if you look at the map of the world, I mean, is one of the few countries that has a geopolitical location that is worth a million times its weight in gold, so to say. Right? Turkey is critical for American strategy. So there's been a tendency in America, especially in government circles, of saying, look, Turkey is too important. We have to work with the Turks, and therefore, and the Turks have gotten used to that. They know that they can get away with things. But for the first time now, between Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism and his decision not to fight ISIS in 2014 and refusing to help the Americans in 2014, kind of turned and shifted the American, shall we say, certainly congressional and certain governmental positions. Then came the S-400 when the Turks bought the S-400 anti-aircraft missile system from the Russians, despite the fact that NATO and the United States vociferously said, please don't do it. It will endanger our new aircraft, the F-35, to which you're part of the consortium that builds it. And Erdogan went ahead and bought them anyway. I think Erdogan was thinking that, look, in the past, yes, they object and then they give in to us. This time it was a step too far for the Americans, and they kicked the Turks from the F-35 program. And there really is now a very different mood in Washington in terms of the approach to Turkey. And you will see that President Biden is going to convene a meeting of democracies around the world next month. It's going to be virtual, but lots of countries have been invited. Turkey has not been invited, and this, is a slap at Turkey because Turkey has stopped being really a democracy. No, there are countries that are a lot worse than Turkey. You will say yes, but then they too have not been invited. But for the Turks, as a NATO member, as a member of the Western Alliance for this long, this is a real slap in the face. So in that sense, you're right. Much of the commonality between Turkey and the United States has disappeared. But Turkey's geostrategic position still remains a very vital component of American strategy. And the trick for the Americans is how to figure out a way to work with the Turks while also opposing what they do. And
how do you see Afghanistan into this? Because yesterday it was announced that Qatar will look after the American interest in Afghanistan. And a lot of people were expecting Turkey to do that. It didn't happen. They clearly trust the Qataris more than the Turk. And the security of Kabul airport is I can't hear anything about it anymore. How do you see Afghanistan as a potential, or even that is gone?
Well, I think the word you used was very critical, trust. And I think between the Qataris and the Turks, the Americans clearly did not trust the Turks, right? I mean, in some sense, it makes sense. I mean, Qatar is a very small country. Qatar, it's easier for the United States to deal with Qatar. The Turks have different interests. I mean, the Turks have interests in Afghanistan that go beyond, shall we say, what the US needs in terms of as a protective power over the American interests there. So there is a conflict of, maybe the Americans thought that there was a conflict of interest between what the Turks are seeking to do in Afghanistan, which is in their own, I mean, they have their own national interests when it comes to Afghanistan. I mean, there are many reasons why the Turks have to be involved in Afghanistan for their own sake. But Qatar is different. I mean, Qatar has little, shall we say, in terms of direct interest in Afghanistan. And also, by the way, the Qataris have been the people who have helped the Americans in terms of extricating Afghans who were working with the United States. A whole variety of, I mean, from people close to America to students, etc. So, so there's been a history of working with the Qataris on this already. So that in a way, that was maybe less surprising that they chose. But you're right. I mean, initially people said, why not the Turks? Because after all, the Turks are a big military power and Qatar is what? A very small, tiny little location with a very small population.
Right. I will finish by mentioning the last sentence of your article when you mentioned the quote, drop by drop, they built a lake. And in your case, they built, it felt like an ocean. And I hope this podcast will raise the awareness of how fighting conspiracies is crucial, because you are not the only victim. The case while they arrested an Israeli couple just for photographing Erdogan palace. And so it is another ordeal linked to another country. And we will start to see more series of all this kind of stuff as long as conspiracy are not fought and as long as we are complacent in handling them. Professor Barkey.
Can I finish with one thing? Last night I was out to dinner with friends who were they were used to work in the State Department. And what I did was I asked them, there was at one point in the 50s, a senator called Joe McCarthy in the United States,
yes,
who started a conspiracy about how the State Department was controlled by communists and that he had the names of so many communist agents in the State Department, etc. And this became a really big conspiracy. I mean, people really believed him, and he was a populist, and he rose in the polls. He was being taken seriously until one day, the Secretary of the Army was testifying in front of the committee in which Joe McCarthy was sitting, and Joe McCarthy said certain things to the Secretary of the Army, and he responded, "Senator, don't you have any shame?" or something to that effect. And that kind of burst the balloon of Joe McCarthy, and from then on, people essentially wrote him off.
right.
It was one person. I mean, people were getting upset at Joe McCarthy, but one person essentially burst the balloon. And that's what you have to do. I mean, you have to take conspiracies on and you have to confront them.
Professor Barkey, it was a pleasure to have you today, and thank you for being with me on this podcast. Thank you again. Follow Turkey Trends, part of Ahval podcast series. Right, can you press end in your side, because it's you who have started?
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.